The sun beat down, hot and unforgiving, on the freshly poured concrete of the small, winding path. Everyone in the Whispering Pines community, or at least, everyone Brenda Patterson, the HOA president, had managed to rally, stood watching. Brenda, a woman whose smile often felt like a grimace, was practically radiating triumph. Her eyes, usually narrowed in suspicion, were wide with self-satisfaction as she gestured grandly towards the sparkling new wrought-iron gate. It gleamed, imposing and ornate, nestled between two freshly erected stone pillars. "And this," she announced, her voice a little too loud, booming across the hushed crowd, "will ensure the integrity and privacy of our communal green space, preventing unauthorized access." Her gaze, sharp and triumphant, snapped directly to me, Alex Johnson. I stood a little apart from the others, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. Brenda's victory lap was in full swing, and this gate, she believed, was her crowning achievement, her ultimate power play. She strode purposefully towards the gate, a heavy brass key clutched in her hand. With a flourish, she inserted it into the lock, ready to twist and seal my supposed fate, to cut me off from what she claimed was her community. The crowd leaned in, some with curiosity, some with thinly veiled amusement, others, like my kind neighbor Sarah Miller, with worry etched on her face. Brenda turned the key with a definitive click, pulled it out, and then pushed the gate. It swung shut with a resounding thud. Her chest puffed out, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. "There," she declared, her eyes still fixed on me, challenging, victorious. "Now, Mr. Johnson, you see how things are done when proper rules are enforced." My quiet smile broadened just a fraction. I simply raised an eyebrow, gesturing subtly with my chin towards the imposing new gate. Brenda, sensing a challenge, followed my gaze. Her triumphant expression began to falter, just slightly, like a tiny crack appearing in a perfectly polished mirror. She looked at the gate, then at the path leading up to it, and then past it, into the thick, overgrown woods that had always bordered my property line. The path continued, neatly paved, right up to the gate, but then, on the other side, it simply vanished. It ended abruptly at a dense wall of untouched foliage, where no human could possibly walk without a machete. The gate, shiny and new, now stood as a magnificent, impressive barrier to nothing at all. Brenda's jaw dropped, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning horror. A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the crowd. This whole elaborate spectacle, this grand declaration of authority, had just been locked against a patch of wilderness, a gate leading absolutely nowhere. The air crackled with a silence thicker than the humid summer air, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant call of a bird. How had it come to this? How had a simple desire to build a life in a peaceful community turned into a bizarre standoff over a gate that served no purpose? My journey to Whispering Pines began not with conflict, but with hope. I had moved here 2 years ago, seeking a quiet corner of the world where I could plant roots, literally and figuratively. After years of living in bustling cities, I longed for the gentle rhythm of a small town, the kind where neighbors knew your name and children played in the streets without a care. Whispering Pines seemed perfect. It wasn't the fanciest neighborhood, but it had character. The houses were older, many needing a fresh coat of paint or a little love, but they were solid, with wide porches and sprawling yards. My own house, a charming bungalow with a neglected garden, immediately stole my heart. I saw potential in every peeling shingle, every overgrown rose bush. My dream was to turn my yard into a vibrant, butterfly-friendly oasis, a place where people could slow down and enjoy the simple beauty of nature. From the moment I arrived, I was determined to be a good neighbor, the kind who lent a hand, shared a cup of sugar, and always had a friendly wave. I believed deeply that a strong community was built on small acts of kindness and empathy. On my first day, while wrestling with a stubborn moving box, a kind-faced woman, Sarah Miller, from across the street brought over a plate of freshly baked cookies. Her smile was genuine, her eyes warm. "Welcome to Whispering Pines," she'd said, her voice soft and inviting. "I'm Sarah. Let me know if you need any help." That simple gesture meant the world to me. It affirmed my decision to move here, reinforcing my belief in the inherent goodness of people. I spent my first few months immersed in my new surroundings, not just unpacking boxes but also reaching out to those around me. I introduced myself to Mr. Henderson, a gruff but ultimately sweet elderly gentleman who lived 2 houses down and spent his days meticulously tending his prized rose bushes. I offered to help Mrs. Davis, a busy single mother, with her groceries one afternoon when I saw her struggling. I even organized a small potluck in my backyard once my garden started taking shape, hoping to bring everyone together. Most neighbors responded with warmth. Children would often stop by my fence, captivated by the vibrant colors of the flowers I was planting. I'd always invite them closer, explaining the different types of plants and the tiny creatures that called them home. These moments, small as they were, filled my heart with a quiet joy. They were the building blocks of the community I envisioned. It wasn't long, however, before I encountered the other side of Whispering Pines, Brenda Patterson. She lived in the largest house on the block, impeccably maintained, with not a blade of grass out of place. Her first interaction with me was not a friendly wave or a plate of cookies, but a sharp rap on my door. I answered, a little surprised, to find her standing there, perfectly coiffed, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Johnson," she stated, her voice crisp and formal, "I'm Brenda Patterson, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." Her tone wasn't exactly welcoming. It was more like an inspection. She proceeded to inform me, in precise detail, about the various rules and regulations of the HOA. She pointed out that my lawn was a little shaggy, and that my choice of mailbox, a rustic wooden one, was not in compliance with the approved aesthetics. I listened patiently, nodding, assuring her I would look into everything. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking she was just a bit overly enthusiastic about her role. Everyone has their quirks, right? I learned quickly that Brenda's quirk was control. Initially, her interventions were minor, almost laughable. A friendly suggestion to trim a bush became a demand. A polite request to move a recycling bin away from plain sight escalated into a formal written notice with a threat of a fine. She seemed to relish finding things wrong, no matter how small. My plans for a wild, natural garden, bursting with native plants, seemed to particularly bother her. She preferred neat rows of manicured shrubs and perfectly mown lawns. "This is a planned community, Mr. Johnson," she'd often say, her lips pursed, "not a wilderness preserve." I tried to explain the ecological benefits, the beauty of diverse flora, but her eyes would glaze over, her mind seemingly already made up. I spent hours reading the HOA bylaws, trying to understand the limits of her authority, but the rules were often vague, leaving much open to interpretation, her interpretation. I'd attend the monthly HOA meetings, hoping to engage in constructive dialogue, but they usually devolved into Brenda listing perceived infractions and demanding adherence to her personal vision of order. Other residents, like Sarah, seemed to share my quiet frustration, but few dared to speak up against Brenda's domineering presence. One sweltering afternoon, while I was diligently weeding my flower beds, Brenda marched across her immaculate lawn, her face set in a grim line. She stopped at my property line, hands on her hips. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice unusually strained, "we have a serious issue." My heart sank a little. "What now? A rogue dandelion? It's your access point." She gestured vaguely towards the patch of untouched woods at the very back of my property, where an old, barely visible deer trail meandered into the forest. This was the same area where the new gate now stood. That path," she spat the word as if it were a curse, "is a security risk. Anyone could just wander onto our common grounds from there. It's unsightly, and quite frankly, it diminishes property values." I tried to reason with her. "Brenda, that's just a deer trail. It's part of the natural buffer between the community and the state park land. It's always been there. She scoffed, dismissing my words with a wave of her hand. It's my property line, Brenda, and it abuts state land, not common HOA property. The bylaws clearly state that the HOA's common green space ends at the edge of the manicured lawn sections, not deep into the wild woods. Nonsense, she declared, her voice rising. The map clearly shows that portion of the woods as part of the communal green space. And unauthorized access is a violation of our safety protocols. We, the HOA, have decided that a new barrier must be erected. My jaw tightened. This was no longer about a mailbox. This was about something much larger, a blatant overreach of power. She was talking about fencing off a part of my land that she wrongly believed was hers. We will be installing a new fence, Mr. Johnson, she continued, a triumphant gleam in her eyes, and a gate. A very sturdy gate. To protect our community. And it will be on your dime, as it's your responsibility to secure your property line. She paused, allowing her words to sink in, fully expecting me to protest, to argue, to plead. But I didn't. A strange quiet settled over me. I simply looked at her, then at the wild, untamed woods, and then back at her, new, determined glint in my eyes. Brenda's smile widened, misinterpreting my silence as defeat. Little did she know, a plan, far more intricate than she could ever imagine, was already beginning to form in my mind. This was no longer just about a small neighborhood dispute. It was about standing up for what was right, about finding a way to respond to unkindness not with anger, but with a clever twist of empathy. The battle for the gate had just begun. Brenda's satisfied smirk remained frozen on her face, a grotesque mask of triumph, even as the murmurs from the assembled neighbors grew louder, shifting from confusion to a strange, almost nervous laughter. She stared at the absurd gate, then at the impenetrable wall of woods beyond, then back at me. Her eyes narrowed into slits, trying to decipher my calm expression, but my face gave nothing away. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated by the growing buzz of whispers. Sarah Miller, my kind neighbor, stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concern, her gaze flitting between Brenda's bewildered face and the gate that literally led nowhere. It was clear she, like everyone else, was struggling to make sense of the scene. Brenda, desperate to regain control of the rapidly unraveling situation, finally sputtered, What is the meaning of this, Mr. Johnson?" Her voice, usually so commanding, cracked with disbelief. I simply met her gaze, a small, knowing smile finally gracing my lips. "It means, Brenda," I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly in the hushed air, "that you've built a very expensive, very grand gate to absolutely nowhere." The words hung in the air, a definitive statement that shattered the last vestiges of Brenda's composure. Her face flushed a deep crimson, and she began to stammer, but the blueprints. The survey. This is common area. She fumbled for her clipboard, scattering papers onto the ground as if the physical evidence could somehow conjure a path where there was none. The sheer absurdity of it all was finally dawning on the onlookers. A few discreet chuckles broke through the silence, quickly stifled, but enough to fuel Brenda's furious embarrassment. She looked like a general whose grand battle plan had just led his army off a cliff. The moment was deliciously ironic, a perfect culmination of her relentless overreach. The seeds of this strange confrontation were planted months before, long after I had settled into Whispering Pines and Brenda's initial, nitpicky complaints had begun to escalate. I had tried, truly, to be understanding. My philosophy in life was to always approach challenges with an open heart, to seek common ground even with those who seemed intent on finding friction. I believed that most people, even those who acted aggressively, were simply trying to feel heard, to assert some form of control in their lives. Perhaps Brenda's constant need for order stemmed from a deeper insecurity, a fear of chaos. This perspective, born from years of observing human nature and choosing empathy over anger, allowed me to respond to her escalating demands with a measured calm that often disarmed her, or at least, left her frustrated. One mild spring morning, I received a particularly lengthy and aggressively worded letter from the HOA. It wasn't just about my garden's overgrown appearance or my non-compliant wooden mailbox anymore. This one specifically targeted the small, almost invisible deer trail at the very back of my property. It was a charming, winding path, barely wide enough for a person, that meandered through a thicket of old oak trees, marking the boundary where my yard met the untouched woods of the adjacent state park. For generations, this trail had simply existed, a quiet passage for local wildlife and a natural, verdant barrier. The letter, however, declared it a breach of security and a direct threat to community aesthetics. It demanded that I secure the perimeter with an approved fence, failing which the HOA would install one themselves and charge me for it, complete with hefty fines. The letter even suggested a new, community access gate at that very spot, implying it would somehow serve the residents, even though it led only to dense, public forest land. This was a new level of aggression. It wasn't just about my choice of garden gnome, it was about my actual property lines, something far more fundamental. My immediate reaction was a wave of frustration. I had meticulously researched the property deeds and surveys before purchasing the house. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the deer trail and the immediate wooded area beyond it were part of my deeded land, right up to the state park boundary. Brenda's claim that it was communal green space was a blatant falsehood, a desperate attempt to expand the HOA's reach. I considered storming over to her house, armed with documents, ready to engage in a furious debate. But then, I paused. What would that achieve? More anger? More division? It would simply feed into the cycle of conflict. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of my core belief: kindness and cleverness often achieve more than brute force. I decided to try a different approach. I invited Brenda over for a cup of tea. She arrived, looking impeccably dressed, clutching her ever-present clipboard like a shield. I offered her the best china, brewed her favorite Earl Grey, and even baked some of Sarah's famous lemon bars. I smiled, listened patiently as she reiterated her concerns about the wildness of my property, her fear of undesirables wandering in from the park, and the urgent need for a proper barrier. I nodded, acknowledged her concerns, and even agreed that security was important for everyone. I explained, calmly and clearly, that while I understood her desire for order, the land in question was definitively mine, and installing a fence there would be an infringement. I showed her the property survey, hoping that presenting the facts in a calm, non-confrontational manner would help her see reason. For a moment, I thought I had gotten through to her. Her gaze softened slightly as she looked at the survey, then at my neatly arranged teacups. She even complimented my lemon bars. It was a brief flicker of civility, a moment where I genuinely believed we could find a peaceful resolution. Perhaps, I thought, she just needed to be educated, to understand the facts without feeling attacked. I suggested we could work together on a different solution for security, something that respected my property rights while addressing her concerns, perhaps a small, decorative fence further back on the actual common land, clearly marking the HOA's boundary. The very next day, however, any hope I had for amicable resolution was shattered. I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. Looking out my window, my blood ran cold. A team of workers, hired by the HOA, had already begun clearing a wide swath of trees and underbrush exactly where Brenda had demanded the new fence and gate. They were clearly on my land, tearing through the natural habitat I had worked so hard to cultivate. The peaceful deer trail was being obliterated, replaced by a raw, muddy trench. Brenda stood nearby, arms crossed, overseeing the operation with a smug, triumphant look on her face. She saw me at the window and gave a small, condescending wave. The message was clear: she hadn't listened to a word I said. She had ignored the survey, dismissed my kindness, and proceeded with her unilateral, aggressive plan. This was no longer a minor dispute. This was an outright invasion, a blatant disregard for my property rights and the very concept of good neighborly conduct. My initial frustration morphed into a simmering indignation. But even then, I refused to let anger dictate my actions. I would not descend to her level. Instead, a seed of an idea, born of observation and a deep understanding of human nature, began to sprout in my mind. Brenda wanted a grand gate to nowhere? Brenda wanted to make a public display of her power? Very well. I would give her that display, but it would be on my terms, and the punchline, unseen by her, would be entirely at her expense. The workers continued to dig, oblivious, creating the path to their own comedic downfall. The more aggressively Brenda pushed, the more clearly I saw the path to a subtle, yet undeniably impactful, countermove. The heavy thud of the machinery echoed through the morning, signaling not my defeat, but the beginning of a truly unexpected turn in the HOA saga. Brenda's face, a mask of confusion and mounting fury, perfectly mirrored the chaos that had erupted around the absurd gate. The small crowd of neighbors, initially hushed, now buzzed with unrestrained whispers and outright chuckles. Sarah Miller, unable to contain her amusement, clapped a hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent laughter. Mr. Henderson, usually stoic, openly guffawed, pointing a gnarled finger at Brenda and the ridiculous gate. The workers, who had been standing by, began to pack up their tools, their faces etched with a mixture of bewilderment and the dawning realization of the comical blunder they had just been part of. Brenda, utterly humiliated, looked from the gate to the impassable woods, then to me, her eyes blazing with a mixture of disbelief and pure rage. This is an outrage," she shrieked, her voice cracking, completely losing the veneer of dignified authority she usually wore. "You deliberately misled us. You made us build this mockery." I simply shrugged, a calm and collected presence amidst her storm. "Brenda," I stated, my voice even, "I showed you the survey. I told you that land was mine. I invited you to tea and tried to find common ground. You chose to ignore the facts and proceed anyway. This gate, and the path leading to it, are exactly what you asked for. It provides a barrier and security, as per your demands. It just happens to be a barrier to nothing but trees." The sheer logical absurdity of it all seemed to deflate her further. She wanted a public spectacle of her power, and she got it, but the audience was laughing at her, not with her. She turned on her heel, snatching her scattered papers from the ground, and stomped away, muttering threats under her breath about lawyers and severe HOA penalties. The crowd parted, allowing her furious exit, then erupted into open laughter, a collective sigh of relief and amusement. The air felt lighter, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted from Whispering Pines. The morning after Brenda's humiliating retreat, a different kind of quiet settled over the neighborhood. It wasn't the tense quiet that usually preceded Brenda's outbursts, but a peaceful calm, almost like a communal sigh of relief. The absurd gate stood proudly, gleaming in the morning sun, a silent monument to Brenda's overreach. Neighbors who had previously only offered quick, nervous hellos now stopped to chat, their smiles wider, their eyes sparkling with amusement and newfound respect. Sarah Miller came over with a fresh batch of her famous blueberry muffins. "Alex," she began, her voice soft but firm, "you were brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. We've all been so tired of her dictating every little thing. You handled it with such grace and, well, cleverness." Her words, simple yet heartfelt, meant more to me than any public praise. It reaffirmed my belief that even in the face of adversity, kindness and ingenuity could prevail. Word of the gate to nowhere spread like wildfire, not just through Whispering Pines, but to surrounding communities. It became an instant legend, a cautionary tale about HOA power trips. People from nearby towns would sometimes drive by, slowing down to gaze at the majestic, pointless gate, often chuckling as they passed. The incident seemed to break a spell. Residents started to question other long-standing, often illogical, HOA rules that Brenda had imposed. Whispers turned into open discussions at the community park, then into more organized gatherings. The quiet defiance I had demonstrated seemed to empower others to find their own voices. Small acts of rebellion, artistic mailboxes, slightly shaggy lawns, and colorful garden gnomes, began to pop up around the neighborhood, each one a tiny symbol of newfound freedom. Brenda, however, was not one to admit defeat easily. Her initial humiliation quickly morphed into a cold, calculated fury. She vanished from public view for a few days, ostensibly to consult her lawyers, though most suspected she was simply stewing in her own indignation. The usual flurry of HOA notices ceased. This lull, however, was more unsettling than her previous constant barrage. It was the calm before a much bigger storm. I knew Brenda wouldn't let this go. Her reputation, her very identity as the all-powerful HOA president, had been publicly ridiculed. She would seek revenge, and it would likely be far more personal and vindictive than anything she had attempted before. My sense of peace, while genuine, was tempered by a growing unease. One afternoon, I was out in my garden, enjoying the soft hum of bees among my newly planted lavender, when a sleek, black car, one I didn't recognize, pulled up slowly to the curb. It was a formal, intimidating vehicle, the kind that usually signaled serious business. A man in a sharp suit, carrying a heavy briefcase, stepped out. He looked less like a neighbor and more like a corporate lawyer. He walked directly to my front door and knocked, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't another HOA notice, this felt different, far more serious. I had a feeling Brenda had upped her game. This wasn't about fines or gates anymore. This felt like a direct, personal attack, designed to strike at the very foundation of my life here in Whispering Pines. The visit hung in the air like a threat, casting a long shadow over the newly found peace of the neighborhood, and I knew, instinctively, that the fight was far from over. The man in the sharp suit stood on my porch, his face devoid of expression, a stark contrast to the colorful flowers blooming in my garden. He held the heavy briefcase as if it contained secrets or perhaps, bad news. My mind raced, trying to anticipate Brenda's next move. Had she found some obscure bylaw, some forgotten clause in the HOA documents, that she could twist to her advantage? Or was this something far worse, a personal vendetta aimed at forcing me out of Whispering Pines entirely? I took a deep breath, determined to remain calm, to face whatever she threw at me with the same steady resolve that had led to the gate to nowhere. I opened the door fully, offering a polite but firm smile. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice betraying no hint of the apprehension I felt. "Mr. Alex Johnson?" he queried, his voice flat, professional, and devoid of warmth. "My name is Mr. Harrison. I'm an attorney representing the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." He didn't offer to shake my hand, simply extended a thick manila envelope towards me. "I have a legal notice for you." My heart gave a little jolt, but I kept my expression neutral. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of the papers inside. "Thank you," I responded, trying to maintain an air of polite indifference. Mr. Harrison gave a curt nod, turned, and without another word, returned to his black car, which then glided silently away down the street. The ominous visit left a chill in the warm afternoon air. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, the envelope clutched in my hand. This was it. Brenda's counterattack. I walked into my living room, sat down at my kitchen table, and slowly opened the envelope. Inside were several intimidating-looking documents, covered in legal jargon and official-looking stamps. My eyes scanned the pages, searching for the core of her accusation. It wasn't about the gate directly, not yet. This was something far more insidious. The documents outlined a formal lawsuit, brought by the HOA, alleging that my unapproved modifications to my property, specifically my native plant garden and the small pond I had installed for local wildlife, constituted a nuisance and a health hazard to the community. They claimed my garden attracted undesirable insects and that the pond was a breeding ground for mosquitoes, despite the fact that I had invested in natural mosquito deterrents and had a healthy ecosystem thriving within it. They demanded that I immediately remove all non-compliant landscaping, fill in the pond, and restore my yard to a uniform, manicured state, or face significant daily fines and further legal action. The claims were baseless, bordering on absurd. My garden was a haven for butterflies, bees, and small birds, a source of quiet beauty and ecological balance in a neighborhood that increasingly favored sterile lawns. The pond was clean, filtered, and teeming with beneficial insects that kept any mosquito population in check. I had even consulted with local environmental experts to ensure it was properly maintained. This was clearly Brenda's vengeful way of attacking something she knew I cherished, something that was a deep part of my personal identity and vision for my home. It wasn't about rules, it was about control and punishment. The sheer audacity of her accusation filled me with a deep, quiet anger, but it was an anger tempered by resolve. I wouldn't let her bully me, not now, not ever. I spent the rest of the day poring over the legal documents, highlighting key phrases, and scribbling notes. I called Sarah Miller, who listened with a mix of shock and sympathy. "This is just vindictive, Alex," she exclaimed. "Everyone loves your garden. It's the most beautiful yard in the neighborhood." Her support, and the knowledge that other neighbors appreciated my efforts, strengthened my resolve. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I needed expert advice. My first call was to a local attorney specializing in property law and HOA disputes. He listened carefully as I explained the situation, from Brenda's initial demands to the absurd gate and now this lawsuit. He assured me that her claims were weak, especially given my adherence to environmental best practices and the lack of any real evidence of a nuisance. However, he also cautioned me. HOA lawsuits, even baseless ones, can be incredibly draining, Mr. Johnson, he warned. They require time, money, and a lot of emotional energy. Brenda Patterson clearly has resources and a strong desire to win. He suggested that we gather testimonies from neighbors, scientific evidence about my garden's benefits, and perhaps even bring in an expert witness. This was going to be a long, arduous battle, a drawn-out war of attrition rather than a quick skirmish. The thought of fighting this in court, spending countless hours and dollars, was disheartening. I had moved to Whispering Pines for peace, not for legal battles. But Brenda had left me no choice. This wasn't just about my garden anymore, it was about standing up to a bully, about protecting my home and the principles of kindness and community that I held dear. The community, having celebrated Brenda's previous humiliation, now watched with a growing sense of unease as the legal battle unfolded. News of the lawsuit spread, bringing a new layer of tension to Whispering Pines. Neighbors would stop me in the street, offering words of encouragement, expressing their outrage at Brenda's relentless pursuit. Many offered to sign petitions or write letters of support. This outpouring of solidarity was a profound comfort, a stark contrast to Brenda's isolated venom. It reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there was an abundance of good in the world, a wellspring of kindness to draw upon. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just fighting for myself, but for the quiet spirit of the neighborhood that Brenda seemed intent on crushing. But Brenda, emboldened by the initiation of legal proceedings, wasn't content to simply wait for the courts. She began a subtle, yet deeply unsettling, campaign of intimidation. One morning, I found a dead, dried-up branch, stripped of its leaves, placed pointedly on my doorstep. It was a small, seemingly innocuous act, but its message was chilling, a warning about the fate of my lush, living garden. Then came the anonymous phone calls, brief hang-ups, or moments of silence before the caller disconnected. I also noticed cars, unfamiliar ones, driving slowly past my house at odd hours, their occupants staring. It felt like a deliberate attempt to make me feel watched, isolated, and vulnerable. The next HOA meeting, usually a sparsely attended affair, was packed. Brenda, radiating an aura of cold determination, presided over it with a new, unsettling gravitas. She didn't mention the lawsuit directly, but her eyes kept flicking to me. She announced a series of new, stricter rules, ostensibly for community safety, that seemed specifically designed to target elements of my lifestyle and my garden. Things like limiting watering hours, banning certain types of garden ornamentation, and even proposing a new rule about excessive wildlife attraction. It was all aimed at making my life here unbearable. Her final announcement, delivered with a chillingly controlled smile, sent a ripple of unease through the room, and effective immediately, she stated, her voice clear and precise, due to ongoing maintenance issues and safety concerns, access to the entire wooded area bordering Mr. Johnson's property, including the area of the new gate, will be completely restricted to all residents. No one is to enter that area under any circumstances. Violation will result in immediate fines and potential legal action. Her gaze lingered on me, a clear challenge. This was an obvious attempt to cut me off, to isolate my property, and perhaps, to control what was now, ironically, the most famous part of Whispering Pines. The meeting ended with a heavy silence, leaving everyone to ponder Brenda's relentless pursuit of power and what extreme lengths she would go to next to regain her tarnished authority. The chilling announcement about restricting access to the wooded area, delivered with Brenda's steely gaze fixed on me, reverberated through the now silent HOA meeting room. It was a clear escalation, a public declaration of war against my presence and, by extension, against any deviation from her rigid vision of the community. As neighbors filed out, many offered me sympathetic glances, a few whispered words of encouragement. Sarah Miller gave my arm a reassuring squeeze. "She's desperate, Alex," she murmured, her voice tight with concern. "Don't let her get to you." I appreciated her words, but a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit anymore. Brenda was attempting to isolate me, to cut me off from the very peace I had sought in Whispering Pines. The days following the meeting felt heavy, permeated by a strange, oppressive quiet. Brenda's absence from casual neighborhood interactions was notable, but her influence was palpable. Unfamiliar cars continued to patrol my street, lingering a little too long. I'd catch glimpses of figures on my periphery, observing me, always just out of clear sight. It felt like a subtle, psychological pressure campaign designed to wear me down. The dead branch on my doorstep had been a grim warning, and now, signs of more direct mischief began to appear. One morning, I found small, thorny weeds scattered deliberately in my carefully cultivated flower beds, clearly not accidental. Another time, my mail, usually neatly delivered, was left crumpled and damp on my porch. These were minor annoyances, but they were precise, irritating, and constant, like tiny stings from a persistent bee. The most unnerving incident, however, occurred late one evening. I was reading in my living room, the only light coming from a single lamp, when I heard a distinct scraping sound from outside. It was a slow, deliberate noise, as if something sharp was being dragged across a hard surface. My heart pounded. I crept to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. In the dim light, I saw a shadowy figure moving near the absurd gate to nowhere. My breath hitched. It was too dark to make out details, but the figure appeared to be wielding some sort of tool, rhythmically scraping it against the brand new stone pillar that held the gate. A chill ran down my spine. Was Brenda vandalizing her own monument to embarrassment? Or was this a new form of twisted intimidation? I watched, frozen, as the figure continued its work for a few more minutes before melting back into the shadows of the woods. The next morning, I rushed out to inspect the pillar. Etched deeply into the pristine stone, clearly visible, was a crudely carved, menacing symbol, a jagged, angry X. It was a stark, disturbing message, a deliberate defacement that went beyond petty HOA squabbles. This wasn't about rules anymore, it felt personal, menacing, a direct threat. My legal team, meanwhile, was diligently preparing for the lawsuit. We gathered affidavits from neighbors who adored my garden, photos documenting its beauty, and testimonials from horticultural experts confirming its ecological benefits and lack of a nuisance. Sarah Miller was a pillar of support, organizing a petition signed by dozens of residents expressing their solidarity with me and their frustration with Brenda's bullying tactics. This overwhelming support was a constant reminder of why I was fighting. Not just for my own property, but for the soul of the community, for the right to live peacefully without arbitrary, vindictive control. The legal fees were mounting, a constant drain on my savings, but the principle at stake felt immeasurable. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, Brenda's tactics grew bolder, more brazen. The seemingly random acts of vandalism escalated. My car tires were mysteriously deflated twice in 1 week. My garbage bins were repeatedly overturned, their contents scattered across my driveway. My internet connection would inexplicably cut out for hours at a time, just when I needed it most. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as an accident by an outsider, but the cumulative effect was undeniable, clearly orchestrated, and deeply unsettling. I installed security cameras, but the perpetrator, whoever it was always just out of frame, a ghost in the periphery. The climax of this insidious campaign came one particularly hot afternoon. I was working in my garden, humming to myself, feeling a rare moment of peace despite the ongoing tension. Suddenly, a strange, acrid smell wafted through the air. My nose twitched. It wasn't a familiar garden scent. It was chemical, sharp, and biting. I looked around, confused, and then my eyes landed on my beloved butterfly bush, which had been flourishing, covered in monarch butterflies just moments before. Its vibrant leaves were curling, turning brown, almost instantly. A horrifying realization dawned on me. Someone had sprayed my plants. I rushed over, touching the leaves, feeling a sticky residue. Within minutes, the beautiful, healthy bush began to wilt dramatically, its blossoms shriveling, the butterflies that had been flitting around it now lying still on the ground, their delicate wings powdered with death. A wave of despair washed over me, cold and sharp. This wasn't just vandalism. It was an act of cruelty, an attack on something living, something I had poured my heart and soul into cultivating. It felt like a direct assault on my spirit, a deliberate attempt to kill the joy and life I had brought to this small patch of earth. Looking up, past the wilting plants, my gaze landed on Brenda Patterson's house. She was standing on her porch, perfectly still, watching me. Her face held no expression, no hint of triumph or regret, just a cold, unwavering stare. It was a silent, chilling confession, a powerful message that left no doubt in my mind about who was responsible. The sheer maliciousness of the act was a new low, leaving me shaken to my core. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a venomous intent, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that Brenda's escalating war against me was far from over. This act of eco-terrorism against my garden pushed the conflict to an extreme, unforgivable level, making me question how much more I could endure. The sight of my dying garden, the butterflies still and lifeless on the withered leaves, felt like a punch to the gut. Brenda's unyielding stare from her porch, cold and triumphant, solidified the horrific truth. This wasn't just about rules or property lines anymore, it was about destroying something beautiful, something I loved. A profound sadness settled over me, heavier than any legal threat. Yet, amidst the despair, a flicker of defiance ignited. I wouldn't let her win. I wouldn't let her extinguish the life I had so carefully nurtured, both in my garden and in this community. I turned away from her chilling gaze, my heart aching but my resolve hardening into steel. The immediate aftermath was a blur of frantic action. I contacted my attorney, his voice grim as I described the poison plants and Brenda's silent confession. He assured me we would document everything, adding this malicious act to the growing list of her escalating aggressions. I also reached out to local environmental groups and a trusted horticulturist who had previously admired my garden. They were appalled, offering their support and expertise. Together, we meticulously collected samples of the damaged plants and soil, sending them off for laboratory analysis. The evidence, though circumstantial, was building, painting a clear picture of a campaign of harassment. News of the poisoned garden spread quickly through Whispering Pines, igniting a fresh wave of outrage. What Brenda intended as a final, crushing blow instead backfired spectacularly. Neighbors, who had been quietly supportive, now openly condemned her actions. Children, who had delighted in watching the butterflies in my yard, wept over the dead insects. Sarah Miller organized an impromptu candlelight vigil in front of my house that evening. Dozens of residents gathered, their faces etched with concern and anger. They brought small potted plants, flowers, and even little drawings of butterflies, placing them gently along my fence line. It was a silent, powerful protest against Brenda's cruelty, a collective statement of empathy and solidarity that moved me to tears. Brenda, however, remained outwardly unfazed by the community's condemnation. She seemed to relish the controversy, convinced that public opinion would eventually swing back in her favor. She continued to act as if she were untouchable, secure in her position as HOA president, using her power to issue stern warnings to anyone who dared to openly support me. She even tried to impose fines on neighbors who placed plants or drawings on my fence, claiming they violated aesthetic guidelines. But her authority was weakening, like a cracked dam. More and more residents openly defied her, leaving their sympathetic gestures on my property, their collective courage growing with each act of rebellion. The once feared HOA meetings now saw more dissenting voices, more challenges to her dictatorial reign. The legal battle dragged on, a slow, tedious process that felt designed to exhaust. Depositions were taken, documents exchanged, and expert witnesses consulted. My attorney presented the lab results confirming the presence of a powerful herbicide on my plants, along with testimonies from neighbors witnessing Brenda's behavior. The gate to nowhere became a central piece of evidence, a symbol of Brenda's irrational overreach. The judge, clearly growing impatient with the HOA's flimsy claims and Brenda's increasingly erratic behavior, urged both parties to consider mediation. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance to find a resolution outside of a protracted courtroom drama. Just as the mediation date was set, a new, utterly unexpected development rocked Whispering Pines. One morning, the neighborhood awoke to sirens wailing in the distance, growing louder until they converged on Brenda Patterson's house. Police cars, an ambulance, and even a fire truck, lights flashing, created a chaotic scene. Neighbors spilled out of their homes, whispering, wondering what new drama Brenda had caused. A frantic whisper rippled through the crowd, someone broke into her house. And then, a more disturbing detail emerged, they found her, unconscious. The news spread like wildfire, painting a terrifying picture. Brenda, the unyielding HOA president, was at the center of a genuine crisis, one that had nothing to do with me, or gates, or gardens. The very next day, a detective from the local police department knocked on my door. His face was grim. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice low and serious, "we need to ask you some questions about Brenda Patterson. Specifically, about the wooded area behind your property, and the new gate." My heart pounded. The gate to nowhere, the absurd symbol of her defeat, was now at the center of a much darker mystery. The detective's questions were precise and probing, focusing on the history of the gate, the arguments with Brenda, and my movements on the day of the incident. I calmly recounted the entire story, from my initial move to Whispering Pines, my attempts at building community, Brenda's escalating harassment, the infamous gate, and the recent poisoning of my garden. I explained that the gate led to state park land, a wild, untamed area, and that I had absolutely no reason to enter her property. The detective listened intently, taking copious notes, his expression unreadable. He seemed particularly interested in Brenda's decision to restrict access to the woods and the menacing X carved into the gate pillar. He confirmed that Brenda was stable but had suffered a concussion and was heavily sedated. The official report stated she had been found unconscious near her back door, which was partially open. There were signs of forced entry, but nothing appeared to be stolen. As the days passed, a strange, uneasy quiet settled over Whispering Pines. Brenda remained hospitalized, and the police continued their investigation, interviewing more residents, including Sarah Miller, who confirmed my account of Brenda's escalating vendetta. The community was gripped by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The lawsuit against me was put on hold, a surreal pause in the ongoing conflict. Without Brenda's relentless drive, the HOA seemed to flounder, its authority weakened. The plants and drawings remained on my fence, a testament to the neighborhood's quiet rebellion. Life felt suspended, waiting for Brenda's recovery, waiting for answers to the mystery of what had happened in her meticulously ordered home. Then, one morning, 2 weeks after the incident, the detective returned. He sat down in my living room, looking less grim, almost relieved. "Mr. Johnson," he began, "we've closed the case on Brenda Patterson's break-in." It turns out, there was no break-in. My eyebrows shot up. "No break-in?" I repeated, confused. He nodded. "No. Ms. Patterson, in her semi-conscious state, provided some inconsistent statements. We've reviewed security footage from a neighbor's camera, a very discreet one, and it tells a different story. It appears Ms. Patterson, in a fit of rage, attempted to dismantle the gate herself." He paused, allowing the absurdity of the revelation to sink in. "She was trying to remove the gate, probably intending to reinstall it somewhere else, or perhaps just destroy it out of spite. She was using a heavy-duty wrench to loosen the bolts, but the gate, as you know, is quite sturdy." He leaned forward, a faint smile playing on his lips. "She apparently got a bit too aggressive, lost her footing, and the wrench slipped, hitting her squarely on the head. She knocked herself out, then stumbled into her house, leaving the door ajar before collapsing." A burst of astonished laughter escaped me. It was so utterly, perfectly, tragically Brenda. The woman who built a gate to nowhere had, in her fury to undo her own blunder, managed to knock herself out. The detective continued, "The X on the pillar? Forensic analysis shows it was carved with the same wrench she was using. She was likely trying to mark it for removal, or perhaps just lashing out. The missing items from her house? She had simply misplaced them in her frantic, muddled state after regaining consciousness for brief periods. The sinister break-in was nothing more than Brenda's own fury turning against her." The news spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire, far faster and more amusingly than any of Brenda's previous edicts. The community erupted in a mix of incredulous laughter and profound relief. The "gate to nowhere" was no longer just a symbol of my triumph, it was a testament to Brenda's self-inflicted downfall. The tide had truly turned. Brenda, once the feared HOA president, was now a figure of ridicule, her authority utterly shattered. The lawsuit against me was quietly dropped, her claims having disintegrated under the weight of her own bizarre actions and the community's overwhelming support for me. My garden slowly began to heal, new shoots emerging from the poisoned ground, nurtured by the collective kindness of the neighborhood. The children brought me new butterfly eggs and caterpillars, eager to help rebuild the ecosystem. Sarah Miller organized a community garden day, where everyone helped to plant new flowers and clean up the yard. Brenda, upon her release from the hospital, attempted to resume her HOA duties, but her pronouncements were met with open skepticism, even quiet defiance. Her power had evaporated, replaced by the collective will of a community that had found its voice. Her grand, empty gate remained, a silent, iron monument to her epic, self-defeating blunder, and a constant reminder that sometimes, the most effective way to win isn't with force, but with a clever twist of fate and the unwavering strength of kindness. Whispering Pines had finally found its true peace, no longer dictated by a single, controlling hand, but blooming, much like my resilient garden, with a newfound sense of shared purpose and quiet freedom.